They weren't casting spells or summoning spirits, they were just trying to survive. Tonight, we're stepping into the shoes of those accused of witchcraft. What were their lives really like? And why were they such convenient scapegoats in times of fear? Discover how personal grudges and societal collapses fueled some of the most unjust persecutions in history. The real story of the witch hunts will surprise and haunt you. How does a bad storm or an outbreak of disease spiral into accusing your neighbor of witchcraft? It all starts with fear, the kind that seeps into the cracks of a struggling community like water freezing into ice. In many ways, fear was as common as bread in pre-modern societies. Crops failed mysteriously, animals died overnight. A child came down with a fever, and days later half the house was sick. Science wasn't there to explain fungus in the wheat or an early frost. So when life took a turn for the worse, people wanted answers, and quickly. Often, they found those answers not in what they could see, but in what they imagined. Picture this: a small village, barely scraping by after a harsh winter. The well is running dry. The cattle are thin, and hunger stirs up more than empty stomachs. It stirs mistrust. A single storm destroys a promising harvest, leaving everyone desperate. Maybe that's when someone mentions the old widow who lives alone on the edge of the village. She used to be a midwife years ago, but now she doesn't seem to fit in. Whispers begin. What if she cursed the fields? What if this is her revenge? Suddenly, someone in town isn't just different. They're dangerous. These fears weren't random. They dug their roots into centuries of folklore and superstition, stories passed around fires and whispered to children at night. Witches, according to these tales, weren't just ordinary people. They were agents of something darker. In Christian Europe, that something was Satan himself. Preachers warned their congregations about the devil's cunning, how he worked in secret, using human pawns to do his bidding. These sermons painted vivid pictures of witches causing illnesses, poisoning livestock, and wrecking homes. And in a world where explanations were few, these ideas took hold. It's easy to shake our heads now and think, how could they fall for that? But back then, survival wasn't guaranteed. Life was fragile, and the unknown was terrifying. People couldn't see bacteria or grasp weather patterns, so they relied on whatever explanation made sense to them. A neighbor's jealousy, a healer's failed remedy, or an outsider's strange behavior, all of it could become part of a story that explained their suffering. And these stories spread fast, traveling well beyond one village or town. One of the earliest well-documented cases of witch panic happened in the 15th century, though suspicions go back even further. Take, for instance, the Alpine region of what's now Switzerland. There was a series of plagues and crop failures in the late 1400s, leaving people in despair. During these crises, local courts began prosecuting individuals for allegedly practicing witchcraft. They blamed everything from dead cattle to sick infants on maleficium or harmful magic. These accusations snowballed. It wasn't enough to punish just one or two people. Entire groups were rounded up and interrogated, often under brutal methods. And what started as scattered claims of strange behavior turned into a full-blown epidemic of accusations. What's especially striking is how often the accused were people already on the margins of society. Older women were frequent scapegoats, especially if they lived alone or had no strong male protector. Add in any traces of herbal knowledge or healing, and suspicions skyrocketed. To many, their remedies seemed unnatural. If a herbal poultice failed to save a sick child, it was easier to blame the healer's dark arts than to accept the randomness of illness. Fear also had a way of amplifying small slights and conflicts into something much bigger. Let's say someone's cow wandered into another person's garden, ruining the harvest. That's frustrating, sure, but people live on edge when food is scarce. Fences become battlegrounds, and neighbors' tempers boil over. It doesn't take much for gossip to evolve into accusation. Someone recalls a strange look or an innocent comment taken out of context. "She said my cow wouldn't produce milk again." Suddenly, misfortune has a human face. Religious leaders added fuel to the fire, often unintentionally, though not always. During the height of witch hysteria, it became common for clergy to speak of witches as organized conspirators, an underground network devoted to dark powers. These ideas weren't plucked from the air. They were borrowed from texts like Malleus Maleficarum or The Hammer of Witches, a treatise that outlined exactly how to spot, interrogate, and convict witches. Written in the late 1400s, the book described witches as active threats to God's creation, making the job of hunting them not just a legal duty, but a sacred one. And its influence spread quickly, giving courts and communities the framework they'd need for centuries of persecution. But the fears weren't only about witches as individuals. They were about control over chaos. When entire communities fell to ruin after famines or diseases, mistrust multiplied. You can almost feel the tension, the way neighbors would eye each other, wondering who might be cursed, or worse, who might have caused the curse. It created a kind of social quicksand. The harder you tried to escape suspicion, the deeper you might sink into it. Imagine, for instance, a town council deciding that the root of their problems wasn't the harsh winter or an unseasonably dry summer. Instead, they've decided someone among them is working against the common good. Once that idea takes root, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge. A weird coincidence, like someone being seen near a field the night before it flooded, transforms into concrete proof of guilt. Does this sound irrational? It absolutely was, but irrational fears don't need logic to thrive. They just need the right conditions. Fear over survival, sprinkled with some superstition and stoked by authority figures, was a recipe for disaster. It created an environment where anything unusual became a threat, and the stakes weren't just individual reputations. They were lives, and this fear wasn't contained to small villages. Entire regions bought into the narrative that witches were to blame for their misfortunes. Everywhere, there was this growing sense of unease, combined with a demand to do something about it. Like a wildfire needing only a spark, local fears gave way to larger, more organized efforts. Declaring someone a witch was no longer just about protecting a village. It became a way to assert control, reinforce authority, and even settle old scores. By the end of the 15th century, we see the beginnings of witch trials that looked less like personal vengeance and far more like societal purge. What's chilling is how quickly this spiraling fear turned into a system, a process of persecution far larger and more brutal than anyone could have imagined. But what drove individuals to actually step forward and accuse their neighbors of witchcraft? Was it genuine fear or something more sinister? That's where things get even darker. What would make someone look across the fence, point at their neighbor, and say, "Witch"? Fear played its part, sure, but it rarely acted alone. Behind every accusation, there was almost always something personal. An old grudge, a bitter rivalry, or a golden opportunity disguised as moral outrage. People didn't just wake up one morning and randomly decide their neighbor could fly on a broomstick. These accusations weren't accidents, they were strategies. Take jealousy, for instance. Imagine living in a small village where everyone knows your business. If your neighbor suddenly comes into a little extra luck, maybe their fields look healthier or their goats produce more milk, it doesn't take long before whispers start spreading. What if their success wasn't natural? What if it came from unnatural means? Accusations were a way to level the playing field, especially in communities where survival was a constant competition. And sometimes it didn't even take jealousy. Just an argument over something as small as a fence line or whose chicken wandered where. A neighbor's bad mood could turn into your worst nightmare. Some of the most blatant accusations came down to greed. In some places, accusing someone of witchcraft could mean their property was confiscated by authorities, and guess who might end up profiting? That's right, often the person who pointed the finger. In 1612, in Lancashire, England, the infamous Pendle witch trials started in part because of bad blood between families. One family, the Whittles, accused members of the rival Demdike clan of using witchcraft to harm them. But when you peel back the layers, you see that land disputes and money troubles were at the heart of it. By accusing the Demdikes of casting spells, the Whittles not only rid themselves of rivals, they also took over some of the land that became available after the trials. But the greed wasn't always about land or wealth. Social standing was just as valuable in a tight-knit village. If you were the one to discover a witch, you might find yourself praised for saving the town. You were suddenly braver, more pious, more necessary. For someone on the lower rungs of the social ladder, crying witch was like shouting, "Look at me, I'm important." It's a twisted kind of heroism, but it worked. The accused, on the other hand, was painted as a threat to the community, a perfect scapegoat if you had unfinished business with them. Gender was another factor. It wasn't just any neighbor who got accused. Women, particularly widows or healers, were some of the easiest targets. In communities that valued conformity, independent women stood out. A widow without a man to speak for her was seen as someone who didn't fit into the social structure. She might survive on her own, practice herbal medicine, or even just be outspoken, and that was enough to make people uncomfortable. Women who provided remedies for illnesses or midwifery services often occupied a strange space in society. On one hand, they were relied on for their knowledge. On the other, failure to cure someone could easily be twisted into evidence of malicious intent. A healer's medicine doesn't work. Witchcraft. A neighbor's child gets sick after visiting her home. Definitely witchcraft. These dynamics weren't unique to small villages either. Gender stereotypes about women being more tempted by the devil or weaker of mind were baked into the cultural and religious narratives of the time. It's no coincidence that women made up the overwhelming majority of those accused. It wasn't just that they were seen as different, it was that they were seen as dangerous. Their independence, their expertise, or even just their way of being outside the norm made them perfect candidates for suspicion. What makes this even darker is how accusations could rip apart families and friendships. Paranoia ran so deep that even your own relatives might not save you. In some cases, they'd be the first to accuse. During the Salem witch trials, a girl named Betty Paris accused her cousin, Abigail Williams, of witchcraft after witnessing strange behavior. Whether it stemmed from actual fear or something more calculated, the accusation didn't just destroy Abigail's life. It shifted the blame away from Betty, who had been under suspicion herself. This pattern played out again and again, where people turned on those closest to them in order to protect their own lives. Accusations didn't need much justification. They just needed a story that stuck. And history shows us how easy it was to create that story. Many accusers framed their targets as different. An old woman who muttered to herself, a neighbor whose habits didn't quite line up with the rest of the village. Framing could be simple, like saying someone always looked too clean for the amount of work they did, or terrifyingly specific, like accusing someone of shape-shifting into a cat. It wasn't about evidence as much as it was about painting a picture that the rest of the community could believe. But let's not give these accusers too much credit for subtlety. Often, they hid very human motives behind the facade of righteous anger. Sure, they'd cry about the devil and the good of the village, but underneath it all, they wanted something: land, money, security, or status. For some, accusing a neighbor wasn't just survival, it was opportunity. One historian puts it best: the motivations behind accusations were often rooted in very human desires, not moral outrage. That's a polite way of saying people were out for themselves. And once an accusation was made, it was like setting a boulder at the top of a hill. It wasn't going to stop rolling on its own. The accused rarely stood a chance, because suspicion alone was enough to condemn them. Someone thinks you looked at them funny in church? Witch. Your cow produced sour milk? Witch. You didn't say good morning with a big enough smile. A full-on witch. It's absurd now, but at the time this logic was considered truthful enough to ruin lives. Communities were already fragile, and these personal motives tapped into that fragility, amplifying mistrust. Every argument or competition could turn into something deadly. If you weren't careful, your life might become someone else's stepping stone. And the worst part, anyone could be accused. No one was immune, not even children. In parts of Europe, there were cases of children accusing parents, pressured by community leaders or spurred on by fear themselves. It became a free-for-all of finger-pointing, where the slightest misstep could seal someone's fate. The pattern was clear. Accusers weren't purely swept up in mass hysteria. They were often acting out of self-interest, and while fear of witches certainly played a role, it was fear fed by ambition, jealousy, and desperation. These weren't the actions of people standing up for justice. They were the grim calculations of a world that made survival a competition. But once you were accused, survival wasn't just a matter of luck. It was a matter of proving your innocence, and that was nearly impossible. Let's talk about the sinister, absurd, and downright cruel methods they used to decide who was guilty. Imagine this. You're accused of witchcraft. Maybe it was your odd habits, a bad harvest, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now your guilt has to be proven. Here's the catch. None of the evidence makes any sense, and even survival itself might be damning. Could you escape? Spoiler alert. Almost no one did. One of the most infamous methods used to test witches was the swimming trial. It sounds ridiculous now, but back then it was deadly serious. The logic, or what passed for logic, was this: water, being pure, would reject a witch. They believed the accused would float if they were guilty because the water would quite literally cast them out. But if they sank, innocent. Of course, sinking often meant drowning because rescue wasn't exactly part of the plan. Either way, these trials were a terrifying lose-lose situation. Can you imagine, hands tied, being thrown into a freezing river, gasping for air while a crowd of neighbors yells from the bank? Ironically, even a little air in your lungs might keep you floating, enough to prove your guilt and seal your fate. But the swimming test wasn't the only ordeal. Witchcraft trials often involved an unsettling obsession with the body. Authorities would search for what they called witch marks. These were physical blemishes, moles, scars, birthmarks, or even something as small as a freckle. Any mark deemed unusual could apparently be proof of a deal with the devil. Inspectors were tasked with poking and prodding the accused, sometimes using sharp needles to see if a spot was insensitive to pain, another supposed sign of a witch. These examinations were invasive and humiliating, yet completely arbitrary. A mark that might go unnoticed on one person could send another straight to the gallows. And the worst part? Many of these physical traits were simply normal variations of the human body or signs of aging. But let's talk about one of the most absurd forms of evidence: spectral evidence. This wasn't something you could see or touch. It was rooted entirely in accusation and imagination. Say someone testified that they saw your ghostly spectre in a dream, attacking them or doing the devil's work. That testimony could be all it took to convict you. They didn't need physical proof, just their word against yours. And how do you defend yourself against someone's dream? You couldn't. In these cases, the accused were often found guilty based on nothing but another person's fears or vivid imagination. It sounds like a bad joke, but for those on trial, it was life or death. These trials weren't just absurd, they were dangerous, and not just for the accused. The consequences radiated outwards, pulling families and entire communities into chaos. In the case of Salem, Massachusetts, spectral evidence played a huge role. A few young girls claimed they were being tormented by the spectres of townspeople, accusing them one by one. The episodes escalated until dozens of people were accused, with many convicted purely because of what was said about them in dreams and visions. Families were torn apart, neighbors turned on each other, and no one knew who might be accused next. Worse still, trials often relied on the accused confessing to their crimes. And how were those confessions obtained? Torture. Brutal, relentless torture. In Europe, this could mean being stretched on the rack, having limbs twisted beyond their natural limits. In other cases, prisoners were subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, or beatings until they finally gave in and said what their interrogators wanted to hear. Under this kind of duress, many confessed to anything, whether it was true or not. They gave false names, invented co-conspirators, and admitted to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed. Every forced confession was another domino in a growing chain of accusations. In this way, one person's suffering often sealed the fates of many. Even small, humiliating rituals fueled the fire. For instance, pricking witches was a common practice. Officials believed witches had a devil's pact that left certain parts of their body numb. Investigators would jab the accused repeatedly with needles or special pricking instruments, looking for spots that didn't bleed or respond to pain. If they found such a spot, often the result of scar tissue or sheer panic in the accused, that was considered indisputable proof. This wasn't science. It wasn't even logic. It was cruelty disguised as investigation. And yet there's a sinister purpose behind all of it. These tests weren't just about proving guilt. They were about humiliation, control, and maintaining authority. Trials were public events designed to display the power of judges, priests, and local leaders. By parading the accused through grotesque tests and tortures, they sent a chilling message. This is what happens when you step out of line. Don't be different. Don't challenge authority. Stay small, stay compliant, stay silent. It wasn't about justice, it was about fear. To hammer this point home, public executions often capped off witch trials. Hangings, burnings at the stake, or even less dramatic methods like beheading were spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch as justice, so-called, was carried out. These gruesome displays weren't just punishment for the accused. They were warnings to everyone else. The power structures of the time thrived on obedience. And what better way to secure it than by turning every execution into a kind of civic theatre? And don't think this was just local misfortune. Witch hunts and trials became systemic in many places, spreading like wildfire through Europe and later the American colonies. Consider King James VI of Scotland, whose obsession with rooting out witches led to countless executions. His writings on witchcraft, like demonology, not only fueled paranoia, but gave legitimacy to these absurd trials. The influence of texts like this ensured that witch hunts weren't just about individual communities. They were part of a much larger machinery of control. What's chilling when you look at this history is how impossible it was to defend yourself. Evidence could be fabricated, testimony invented. A birthmark you'd carried your whole life suddenly turned into a sign of evil. Your silence might be seen as defiance, while your tears could be interpreted as guilt. Truly, the moment the accusation was made, it was as if the outcome had already been decided. Witch hunts weren't about justice. They were about power. They were about creating visible enemies to keep the invisible ones at bay. They were about channeling fear into something the community could act on, even if that action meant destroying innocent lives. And in the process, they reinforced the authority of judges, priests, and accusers by reminding everyone who held the reins. But what about the people on the receiving end of these accusations? Who were they? Really? Were they the odd, the outcast, and the unlucky? Or was there something more to the pattern of who got accused? To get to the heart of who the so-called witches were, let's take a closer look at the lives they lived, and the lives that were torn apart by a single word: guilty. Imagine living in a world where just existing in the wrong way could turn you into an enemy. That's exactly what it was like for the people most often accused of witchcraft. So, who were they? The easy answer would be to say the accused were the poor, the old, or the marginalized. But the truth is a little more complicated, and much sadder. These supposed witches came from all walks of life. But one thing so many had in common was that society already saw them as problems before the accusations even began. Let's start with women. Women made up the vast majority of those accused, and there's a reason for that. The decks were stacked against them right from the start. Society was set up to keep women in tightly defined roles, often ones that involved obedience, silence, and dependence. A woman's life at the time has been described as hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. Most were married off young, expected to have children, and tied to a rigid set of expectations. Fall outside those expectations even slightly, and suddenly you were under suspicion. A woman living alone was different, a widow without a husband to protect her. Vulnerable. And being vulnerable made you an easy target. Widows were especially at risk. Once a husband died, everything about a widow's position in society became precarious. She might have land or a little money, but no man to shield her. If she managed to stay independent, that in itself could be seen as threatening. Some people dismissed these women as nags, or worse, accused them of being witches. Essentially, their visibility in the community was their downfall. They didn't fit the mold, so they became national scapegoats for things like failed crops or illness sweeping through a village. And then there were the healers and midwives. On the surface, these women were essential to their communities. They provided remedies for illness, helped deliver babies, and carried knowledge about herbs and treatments long before doctors became widely available. But in a world where the church increasingly sought to control both medicine and morality, healers made easy targets. Their independence sparked distrust, and their expertise with plants or childbirth was often twisted into tales of black magic. If a healer gave someone medicine and the patient still died, people whispered about curses or pacts with the devil. Never mind that her knowledge was probably saving lives most of the time. When things went wrong, she bore the blame. At the same time, simply being old could put a target on your back. Elderly women, particularly those seen as frail or strange, were frequently accused. It wasn't just superstition, it was convenience. Older women often lived alone and lacked the resources to defend themselves. They were outsiders, and outsiders were easy to blame. A village might point to the hunched figure muttering to herself in the corner and decide she must be the reason their harvest went wrong. After all, when people are searching for answers to their suffering, they tend to focus on the most powerless around them. But it wasn't just women. The stereotype of the lone crone with a black cat overlooks another group of victims, men. While they were accused less frequently than women, men weren't immune to the hysteria. Sometimes accusations targeted men who failed to conform or openly defied authority. A man who refused to pay his debts, challenged church leaders, or lived on the edge of the community might suddenly find himself branded as a witch. Witchcraft accusations weren't always gendered. They were about control. If your behavior disrupted the order of things, you became a threat, and threats had to be dealt with. Children weren't spared either. In fact, the inclusion of children shows just how wide the circle of fear could grow. Some children were accused alongside their parents, swept up in the same panic, while others became tools in the system, pressured into testifying against adults. Picture a small child dragged into a courtroom, frightened and confused, being asked if they'd seen their mother or neighbor talking to Satan. Communities were so consumed by paranoia that they didn't think twice about involving and condemning the youngest among them. It wasn't just individuals who were targeted. Entire families could be destroyed by an accusation. If one member of a family was accused, it often rippled out from there. A single claim might lead to the arrest of not only the accused, but their relatives, their friends, even their business associates. The logic, or lack thereof, was simple: guilt by association. If people believed one member of the family practiced witchcraft, who's to say the rest weren't involved too? This pattern tore apart families, leaving children orphaned, homes abandoned, and entire legacies shattered beyond repair. And then there's the terrifying fact that entire villages sometimes fell under suspicion. In these cases, a string of misfortunes, bad weather, a livestock epidemic, or a particularly deadly sickness, could spark mass hysteria. It wasn't unusual for dozens of people to be implicated in one wave of accusations, plunging an entire community into chaos. This happened during the Würzburg trials in Germany in the early 1600s, where literally hundreds of people, including clergy and children, were accused and executed. The scale of these witch hunts shows how fear could spiral completely out of control with no one stepping in to stop it. Of course, for the accused, the consequences weren't just about losing their lives. The emotional toll on victims and their communities was immeasurable. Imagine being a healer who had spent her life helping her neighbors, only to have those same neighbors accuse her of sorcery when things went wrong. Imagine being a widowed grandmother, already lonely, and then being interrogated, shamed, and labeled a servant of evil. Families torn apart by trials often struggled to rebuild, even if some members survived. The stigma lingered, and people learned to live with the shadow of accusations hanging over their heads. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all is how random it sometimes was. Sure, there were patterns. Women, the vulnerable, the different. But some victims were simply unlucky. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time was enough to mark someone for destruction. A passing remark, a misunderstood joke, or an annoyed glance could turn into the genesis of a witchcraft accusation. The sheer fragility of life at the time left everyone exposed, because no one could control how others viewed them. And once people decided you were dangerous, your fate was all too often sealed. What really ties all these victims together, though, is how powerless they were to fight back. Whether it was patriarchy working against women, social pressure silencing dissenters, or mass hysteria sweeping through villages, society used accusations to maintain control. Those who didn't fit in, whether because they were too independent, too knowledgeable, or simply in the way, were sacrificed for the illusion of order. So yes, the victims were often healers, widows, and misfits, but they were also ordinary people just trying to survive the randomness of life. They didn't cast spells or whisper curses. They were scapegoats, punished for their vulnerability and for the fears of the people around them. But here's the thing. None of this happened in a vacuum. The witch hunts were a tool, convenient for more than just quelling fear. Behind many of these accusations were larger forces, with leaders and institutions pulling the strings. And the real reason these hunts escalated, it wasn't just fear, it was power. Let's take a closer look at that. Were witch hunts really about witches? Unlikely. If you strip away the hysteria and torches, what you're left with is a tool, one designed to control, distract, and consolidate power. Sure, people were terrified of curses and devils, but let's not give fear all the credit here. The real fire behind these hunts wasn't just burning in villagers' imaginations, it was stoked by those at the top, leaders, clergy, and even neighbors who had much to gain and very little to lose. Let's start with the church, because in so many ways it was the ultimate stage manager of medieval life. At the time, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a landlord, a lawmaker, and the keeper of time itself. It governed everything from when you could marry to how you prepared for death. Missing a Sunday prayer wasn't just skipping out on a sermon, it was sin. And questioning the church, that could cost you everything. Heretics were burned, skeptics were silenced, and witches, well, they were drowned, hanged, or worse. All of it was done with the kind of flair that keeps people in line. The dangers of questioning the church, as one historian puts it, weren't just spiritual, they were brutally physical. Religious leaders had a knack for turning everyday misfortunes into moral lessons. If a harvest failed, it wasn't bad luck or poor weather, it was divine punishment. Disease sweeping through town? That wasn't bacteria, it was a sign of sin. This had a twofold effect. One, it kept people terrified of falling out of religious favor, and two, it positioned the church as the only institution capable of saving both bodies and souls. This dynamic meant that anyone going against church orthodoxy or simply living in a way that didn't fit the community's idea of normal was a potential target. And witchcraft accusations provided the perfect way to get rid of troublesome voices and reinforce orthodoxy. But the church wasn't the only player using fear to its advantage. Political leaders quickly recognized that witch trials could be weaponized for their own goals. In a messy medieval political landscape, where justice was brutal and survival was steeped in chaos, trials were a handy tool to consolidate power. They were an easy way to look like you were defending the people from some grand, invisible evil. You'd have a bunch of angry villagers demanding answers about their crop failures or livestock deaths, and instead of dealing with, say, a corrupt tax collector or a bad irrigation system, you'd point to the nearest witch. Suddenly, the real issues disappear into thin air, and you, the leader, come out looking heroic. Take King James VI of Scotland, for instance. This guy wasn't just obsessed with catching witches. He wrote textbooks about it. Demonology? Anyone? His writings didn't just spread paranoia, they legitimized it, making witch hunts feel like both a moral crusade and a patriotic duty. For James, these hunts served a dual purpose. They reinforced his role as a righteous monarch while deflecting attention from internal political struggles. By rooting out witches, he could consolidate political power and shore up loyalty among his people, all while burying any real critiques of his leadership. And it wasn't just monarchs exploiting the witch hunts. Even at a local level, accusations could be shockingly calculated. In many cases, wealth and property were tied up in the chaos of these trials. Local officials or community leaders could benefit directly when someone was convicted of witchcraft. Property would often be confiscated, redistributed, or snapped up at a fraction of its value. It didn't matter that the evidence was non-existent. What mattered was the opportunity. The accused might have been living independently on desirable land. Their trial solved two problems at once. It got rid of these dangerous individuals while quietly enriching an accuser or their allies. This process let leaders reinforce not only order, but also their personal wealth and influence. What's staggering is how very human desires like greed, revenge, and ambition played into these larger systems of control. Trials became tools to silence dissenters or remove rivals. Maybe someone spoke out against unfair taxes, or they refused to fall in line with the local authorities' plans. The next thing you know, they're being linked to some bizarre story about summoning storms or spoiling milk with magic. The sheer arbitrariness of it is what made it so effective. No one was safe from suspicion. The timing of witch hunts is another big clue that reveals their deeper purpose. These panics didn't pop up randomly. Instead, they flared during periods of crisis, war, famine, political instability. Whenever a community or region hit turmoil, accusations soared. During the 30 Years' War, for example, parts of Europe were so caught up in both religious conflicts and constant violence that the blame game hit frightening extremes. Between 1618 and 1648, some towns executed hundreds of people as witches, even when it was obvious that their real problems stemmed from war, chaos, and collapsed economies. Leaders knew that fear could serve as a powerful distraction from these larger issues. When people are terrified of witches, they stop asking why the king's coffers are empty or why the streets are riddled with disease. There's also something chillingly strategic about how witch hunts targeted nonconformists, those who didn't quite fit into society's rigid roles. Sure, some accusations stemmed from personal grudges, but on a broader scale, these trials were tools of systemic control. People accused of witchcraft often had some kind of friction with existing power structures. Healers who didn't adhere to male-dominated medicine, women living independently of men, or outspoken individuals with dissenting ideas. They all faced heightened vulnerability. Branding them as witches erased the threat they posed to social order, while reinforcing that same order in the eyes of the public. The real witches, as anyone paying attention might have noticed, were those in positions of power, exploiting fear to stamp out defiance. And of course, let's not forget the economic anxieties driving all of this. Witch hunts served as scapegoating mechanisms, redirecting the stress of poverty, famine, and taxation onto the accused. You can imagine the appeal for leaders. Instead of addressing why there isn't enough grain to go around or explaining why taxes seem to rise as supplies dwindle, they just blame someone convenient. The crowd gets a villain, the tensions temporarily ease, and no one begins asking uncomfortable questions about leadership or the church's economic control. In a landscape where the church collected mandatory tithes while hoarding wealth, blaming witches was a very effective way to keep local anger from turning upward. But here's the thing. You can only stoke fear for so long before the damage spreads beyond its original purpose. Witch hunts didn't just silence individuals, they unraveled entire communities. The leaders and institutions pulling the strings might have avoided the initial fallout, but the long-term consequences were catastrophic. Villages and families torn apart, trust decimated, and economies disrupted. And worst of all, the social order these hunts were supposed to reinforce, fragile and blood-stained, exactly as it had been before, but with countless lives lost. And once the hysteria died down, there were often no reparations for the victims. Communities moved forward as if nothing had happened, but the fractures never fully healed. Looking back, the witch hunts weren't about witchcraft at all. They were about maintaining control during uncertain times, enforcing conformity and consolidating power in the face of crises. The paranoia created by these trials didn't root out evil. It allowed those in power to tighten their grip and erase opposition. Where does that leave us? With scorched fields, empty homes, and generations haunted by the weight of what they endured. But the devastation ran deeper than broken families. It echoed through the fabric of society itself. And those cracks, they were only the beginning. Let's take a closer look at how these hunts left communities permanently scarred. What happens to a community when fear and suspicion take over? In the case of witch hunts, the answer is simple. They break. Trust shatters. Families fracture, and the wounds left behind are so deep that even generations later the scars remain. The witch hunts didn't just take lives. They left entire communities crumbling, struggling to find their way forward after all the dust and ashes settled. The damage started on the most basic level. Families. Imagine being a child, suddenly swept up into the madness of accusations. Maybe it's your mother who's accused, or your father, or both. You know they're innocent. They're your parents, your protectors. But in this world, that doesn't matter. You're forced to watch as they're arrested, dragged away, and put on trial. Or worse, maybe you're pulled into it too, pressured to testify against them. Some children, in their fear and confusion, gave forced testimonies that led to the execution of their own family members. Others lost everything when their parents were convicted. Property seized, livelihoods destroyed. Orphans of accused witches faced bleak futures, often shunned or treated as outcasts themselves, as if their parents' crimes had stained them too. Entire family structures dissolved under the strain. Children grew up with grief, shame, and no way to reclaim the futures stolen from them. And the families who somehow survived the accusations, life was never the same. Even if someone was released or acquitted, suspicion didn't simply vanish. The stigma lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to the gallows. Neighbors might avoid them. Communities might whisper behind their backs. Think about it. If the people you'd known for years, the ones you saw every day at the market or shared conversations with at church, had turned on you once, how could you ever feel safe around them again? For survivors, rebuilding trust wasn't just hard. In many cases, it was impossible. The trials didn't just leave emotional and social wounds. They created economic devastation too. In many cases, being accused of witchcraft meant losing everything. Property was seized by authorities, often before someone was even tried, let alone convicted. Homes were abandoned, fields left untended, and businesses permanently shuttered. If a family member had been the main breadwinner, say, a mother who sold herbal remedies, or a farmer who worked the land, their conviction all but guaranteed poverty for those left behind. Communities lost skilled workers, farmers, healers, and midwives, all because of paranoia and greed disguised as justice. And for poorer families, the cost of mounting a defense or simply surviving imprisonment could plunge them into bankruptcy. This wasn't just personal ruin. It rippled out, dragging entire villages into economic uncertainty. Take a moment to picture what that might have looked like. Imagine walking through a village in the aftermath of a witch hunt. Empty homes dot the edges of town, their windows dark, the gardens gone to seed. Maybe the livestock are still there, wandering untended, a haunting reminder of who's no longer around. These weren't just beloved neighbors or friends. The community had depended on them. Their absence left gaps that couldn't be filled. Crops went unharvested, trade slowed, and suddenly everyone was hurting, not just the accused. The system that relied on cooperation and shared labor had been pulled apart, thread by thread, and what was left? Fear, isolation, and a deep sense of loss. But the damage didn't stop with economic hardship. The emotional and cultural scars ran even deeper. Once the trials ended, the communities didn't immediately heal. How could they? The bonds that had once held them together were frayed beyond repair. Neighbors had accused neighbors, friends turned on friends, and those who had stayed silent during the madness still had to live with the guilt of their inaction. How do you look someone in the eye when you suspect they quietly cheered for your conviction, or worse, when you know they profited from it? This kind of betrayal wasn't something people just forgave and forgot. It lingered, unspoken, but present in every interaction. The emotional toll wasn't just felt by individuals. Entire communities bore the weight of shame for what had happened. In some places, the trials became a kind of haunting memory, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. Families who lost loved ones carried the pain forward, their stories kept alive as warnings. But just as often, communities chose silence. Rather than confront the past and acknowledge the harm that had been done, they buried it. No apologies, no reparations, just a collective decision to pretend it hadn't happened. The problem is, silence doesn't equal healing. Those old wounds festered, shaping relationships and dynamics in ways that were hard to see but impossible to ignore. One chilling example of this silence comes from Salem. After the infamous trials ended, the town didn't exactly leap to make amends. Decades later, descendants of the victims were still waiting for the full acknowledgement of the injustice. And while some efforts were made, like reversing convictions or apologizing, many families' lives had already been irreparably destroyed. By the time anyone addressed what had happened, the survivors were long gone. The community had moved on in the practical sense, but the tragedy never fully disappeared. And really, how do you move on from something like this? For some, it meant leaving the place behind entirely. After the trials, there were instances of entire families or groups relocating, hoping to escape their reputations and start fresh. But even in new towns or villages, the stigma often followed them. People love to talk, and bad news spreads in ways that are hard to outrun. Others tried to stay and piece their lives back together, though it rarely came without struggle. With so much trust and stability lost, rebuilding wasn't a simple task. Sometimes there were attempts at reconciliation. In Europe, there are records of communities trying to atone for mass executions decades after they occurred. In one Swiss town, authorities held symbolic ceremonies to restore the honor of those accused centuries earlier. But what was the point? The victims were long gone, and the impact of their loss couldn't be erased by a ceremony or a speech. It's not cynical to say that these efforts, while well-meaning, came too late to matter. They often felt like a way for the living to ease their own guilt, not to truly honor or repair what was taken from the dead. The truth is, the damage of the witch hunts extended far beyond the trials themselves. They didn't just destroy individual lives, they corrupted the very fabric of society. Communities didn't just snap back to the way they were before, they were left more fractured, more suspicious, and more scarred than ever. The fabric of social life was damaged as neighbors turned against each other. Once paranoia takes hold, the fallout doesn't fade. It clings and transforms everything it touches. History remembers these events as tragedies, but for those who lived through them, they were something even worse. Everyday horrors that became impossible to forget. And yet, for all the destruction witch hunts caused, the families ripped apart, the villages left in ruins, the generations scarred, they leave us with echoes, lessons we can't afford to ignore, because if fear and suspicion could unravel communities once, who's to say it couldn't happen again? But before we look to the present, let's pause and ask a final question. What can this dark history teach us about the ways we see and scapegoat each other today? Could something like the witch hunts happen again today? It's easy to dismiss the idea at first. After all, we've got science, laws, the internet. Surely we'd see through the paranoia and scapegoating that fueled those dark moments in history, right? But history doesn't repeat itself word for word, it rhymes. And if you look closely enough, the same patterns that drove the witch hunts are still lurking just under the surface. We've just swapped broomsticks for hashtags. Let's start with the basics. Witch hunts weren't a one-off incident confined to a superstitious era. They were part of a larger cycle, one we've seen unfold again and again. Anytime a society feels uncertain or threatened, whether by famine, war, disease, or political division, it searches for some kind of target, someone to blame for the chaos. It was true back then, and it's true now. The only difference? Instead of dark alleys and village squares, the new hunt plays out in newspapers, courtrooms, and maybe most often on your social media feed. Look at McCarthyism, for example. The 1950s might seem like a long way from the 1600s, but the mechanics were strikingly similar. Back then, it wasn't witches being persecuted. It was alleged communists. Senator Joseph McCarthy launched a crusade against perceived enemies, accusing anyone and everyone of being a Soviet spy. Did he have hard evidence? Not really. Suspicion, circumstantial proof, and fear carried the whole movement. People lost jobs, reputations, and even their freedom. Sound familiar? If this feels like a courtroom out of the witch trials, that's because it was. While McCarthy wasn't waving torches, he, and those who sided with him, were lighting metaphorical fires all over America. Widespread fear, blacklisting, and the destruction of reputations became the trademarks of this modern witch hunt. The fear of communism was real for many, but what people did with that fear echoed those small villages centuries earlier. Blame, accuse, destroy, repeat. And McCarthyism is just one example. Modern society has no shortage of moral panics, waves of fear that seem to grip the public all at once. Remember the satanic panic of the 1980s? If you're unfamiliar, let me explain. It started small, as these things usually do. A few accusations of ritual abuse, some sensationalized media coverage, and boom, a nationwide panic about satanic cults taking over daycare centers. People were falsely accused of horrific crimes, and public opinion turned on them with shocking speed. Just like in Salem, these accusations were fueled not by solid evidence, but by anxiety and, let's be honest, a flair for the dramatic. And once again, lives were destroyed before the truth could catch up. What was driving it? Fear, sensationalized by media and exploited by those eager to profit off catastrophe, just like the witch hunts centuries earlier. The difference now, of course, is technology. In the time of the witch hunts, a false rumor might take weeks to spread. Today, it takes seconds. Social media has become a powerful accelerant for modern hysteria. Clicks, shares, and likes spread mistrust faster than word of mouth ever could. A single tweet or post can turn someone into a pariah overnight. Take cancel culture, for example. It's the internet's answer to the age-old idea of public humiliation and punishment. A mistake, a misunderstood comment, or an allegation doesn't just lead to disagreement. It can snowball into a massive online pile-on. The result? Reputation ruined, career derailed, hate mail inboxes overflowing. And while sometimes criticism is legitimate, far too often, it feels eerily similar to the public denunciations of the past. Let's not forget how accusations can spiral out of control. The internet has no shortage of keyboard warriors ready to accuse, amplify, and condemn, often before the facts are even clear. Social media thrives on outrage. Algorithms reward posts that trigger strong feelings, whether they're true or not. That's why misinformation spreads like wildfire. Take any trending scandal online, and there will be people jumping in with opinions, false claims, and sensational stories, some of which snowball into entirely untrue narratives. The ease with which false narratives can spread online, as a historian might put it, mirrors how rumors of witchcraft spiraled back in the day. A misunderstood interaction, a strange coincidence, or even an outright lie could quickly turn someone into a target. And let's not ignore how fear continues to be weaponized by those in power. Just like religious leaders and monarchs stoked witchcraft hysteria to maintain control, modern leaders sometimes lean on fear and division to distract from larger issues. Scapegoating certain groups as threats to stability or values is an age-old tactic with contemporary weight. Immigrants, protesters, political opponents, it's all too easy to claim they're the root of society's problems instead of addressing systemic issues. History keeps showing us the same trick. Point fingers at an us and an other to keep eyes off the people pulling the strings. The similarities don't stop there. Just like centuries ago, marginalized groups are often the first in line to become scapegoats. Back then, it was the widows or healers, those who didn't neatly fit into the expected social structure. Now it's often racial minorities, LQB plus individuals, or activists who challenge the status quo. Societal fears, coupled with long-standing prejudices, make certain groups easy targets during times of uncertainty. This pattern hasn't disappeared, it's just changed its face. But what can we do about it? How do we break the cycle? The simplest answer might also be the hardest: education. Understanding how witch hunts functioned in the past helps us recognize the warning signs in the present. Fear, misinformation, and power dynamics are still the main ingredients in modern hysteria. By acknowledging these patterns, we can train ourselves to pause when the next wave of outrage or suspicion hits. Are the claims rooted in fact, or are they driven by fear? Who benefits from stirring up this outrage? Asking these questions is a step toward breaking the cycle.